Hi, Connection Group leaders. This week, Troy is going to teach through all of Romans chapter 4. Romans chapter 4 is 25 verses, so it's a pretty big chunk of Scripture. Now, the main point of Romans chapter 4 fits really well into the flow of Paul's thought through Romans thus far. So I want to kind of review that and make sure we know where Romans 1 through 4 is going as a whole. In the first three chapters, Paul worked very hard to establish that all men stand guilty before God, including Gentiles who have never heard the law. They stand convicted by God's revelation through creation and through their own consciences. And Jews that have had the law also stand convicted by the law. That culminates in chapter 3 that we read last week. Chapter 3, verse 9, there is no one righteous, not even one. Or chapter 3, verse 23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Now, Paul, in addition to establishing the guilt of everyone before God, has been working to help everyone understand that the gospel is for both the Jews and the Gentiles. Chapter 3, verse 28, for we conclude that a man is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Or is God for Jews only? Is he not also for Gentiles? Yes, for Gentiles too, since there is one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. So do you see how this all fits into the main statement for the letter that we introduced in Romans 1, verse 16 and 17? These ideas that all are guilty before God and that both Jews and Gentiles stand under the same judgment and will be saved by the same gospel. Remember, chapter 1, verse 16 and 17 says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and also to the Greek. For in it, God's righteousness is revealed from faith to faith, just as is written, the righteous will live by faith. Right there we see those principles that are reviewed in chapter 3. Salvation is by faith. It starts and ends in faith, and that salvation is available to everyone who believes, Jews and the Gentiles. So what he's going to do in chapter 4 is he's going to use two members of the Jewish Hall of Fame, Abraham and David, to illustrate these points. Now, if anyone might have obtained salvation through their deeds and therefore have some right to pride in their own righteousness, it could be Hall of Famers like Abraham and David. But in chapter 4, here's what Paul says about Abraham. Verse 2, if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to brag about, but not before God. For what does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him for righteousness. That's Genesis 15:6. That's what it says about Abraham. And likewise about David. It says in verse 6, likewise David also speaks of the blessing of the man God credits righteousness to apart from works. How joyful are those whose lawless acts are forgiven and whose sins are covered. That's Psalms 32, 1 and 2. So both of these Jewish all-stars were saved apart from works. They were justified by faith apart from works. But both Abraham and David, they were really good guys, right? I mean, they were some of the patriarchs of the faith. Well, sometimes they were good guys, but a fairly quick reading of the Old Testament will show you that Abraham was a sinner. Abraham had sex with his wife's servant. He lied about his wife, said she was his sister so that other guys would have sex with her to protect himself, and he did other things. David, as you know, was a murderer and an adulterer. These guys, these all-stars, they also needed God's righteousness to be imputed to them, to be imparted to them through faith, because their own righteousness simply would not have been good enough. Now, wait a minute. Wasn't Abraham circumcised? Isn't Abraham, as the first circumcised, wasn't he the father of God's people through circumcision? And it raises the question, one, didn't Abraham need to be circumcised for righteousness? And two, doesn't that mean that only then the circumcised can be righteous? Didn't Abraham need to be circumcised for righteousness? And two, doesn't that mean that only the circumcised can be righteous? Paul's answers to both those questions are no and no. Very clearly in the second half of Romans 4, he says, for example, in verse 9, is this blessing only for the circumcised then? Or is it also for the uncircumcised? For we say faith was credited to Abraham for righteousness. In what way, then, was it credited? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while he was circumcised, but uncircumcised. So no, his circumcision was not what accomplished righteousness. It came after. Abraham was credited with righteousness before he was circumcised. And the circumcision was something that God ordained, God asked for after this had already occurred. And then is faith, is the gospel only for the circumcised? And Paul addresses this very clearly in verse 16. This is why the promise is by faith, so that it may be according to grace to guarantee it to all the descendants, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of Abraham's faith. He is the father of us all in God's sight. And that's where we come to understand that Abraham is not just the father of Israel. When God said he was going to make him the father of many nations, he's going to make him the father of all who would follow after him in faith, all who would follow after him by faith, believing in God and trusting in them for their reconciliation to God. This is a great, great passage to illustrate the availability of the gospel to all, and that salvation is by faith. And that as such, there's no room for boasting or pride in our standing before God. Salvation is the work of God by grace through faith. What I want you to do in your groups is to really focus on faith and belief, to just discuss those terms. And I want to kind of encourage you not to make those words more complicated than they are. I want you to read through. I've actually listed about 5 or 6 verses where believe and faith are directly referenced, and read through those. And again, just take the words at face value, that Abraham believed God, but to the one who does not work but believes on him, who declares the ungodly to be righteous, his faith is credited for righteousness. Focus on the words faith and belief and what they show us in Romans chapter 4. So that's the first thing to do. A second thing you could consider doing in your connection group is discuss the question why it's important to understand that God blessed Abraham before he was circumcised. And thirdly, to discuss why our guilt requires Christ's sacrifice in order that God can be just and justifier. That's from the end of Romans chapter 3, where God is just and justifier. So why is it that our guilt demands Christ's sacrifice for God to be both just and our justifier? And that's a great discussion, I think, and it really helps us appreciate what Christ did for us in the sacrifice. A fourth question that you could consider, Paul writes that Abraham believed in God, and this is how it describes God, believed in God who gives life to the dead and calls things into existence that do not exist. How does this description of God apply to Abraham? How did that description of God apply to the Romans? How did they understand it? And how does it apply to you? That the God that we believe in is the one who gives life to the dead and calls things into existence that do not exist. And then lastly, a fifth question that you could consider is this, a question that you can kind of examine yourself. What are the things, what are the acts of righteousness that you would ever be tempted to put confidence in? That is, what is it about you that makes you worthy of God's love? And the answer is that God's love towards you, you're not worthy of it. It's not warranted. It's graceful love. And I want you to consider what this passage says about any righteousness or any merit that can be earned before God through works, and discuss those ideas. And what I think the passage will drive us to is a deep, humble acceptance of grace before God that is warranted by nothing more than our faith and our belief in that God. And not by our own goodness, not by any merit, not by any works that we would bring, but instead something completely undeserved as a function of grace, because we believe in the one true God who gives life to the dead and calls things into existence that don't exist. I think you'll have a great week in connection groups, and hope you have an awesome week there, and we'll talk to you again soon.